There is something strange about the device in your pocket. You paid for it, you carry it everywhere. It holds your photographs, your bank details, your correspondence, and your location history going back years. By any ordinary test of ownership, it is yours. And yet the value it generates, almost all of it, accrues to a handful of companies in California and Shenzhen whose names you did not choose and whose terms you did not negotiate. This is usually described as the price of convenience, or as the inevitable consequence of network effects, or, in the sharper accounts, as surveillance capitalism. I want to suggest a different way of looking at it. Over the past 15 years, the basic infrastructure of the modern economy has quietly changed hands, and nobody has quite worked out what follows from that. The smartphone belongs to a different category of object than anything we have had ownership frameworks for before. The hardware sits in your hand, the electricity comes from your bill, and the data originates from your life. For all its apparent power, the platform is renting something from you, even if the lease was never written down. What the phone absorbed. 15 years ago, the functions now collapsed into a single glass rectangle were spread across half a dozen separate industries: cameras, calculators, atlases, bank branches, record shops, encyclopedias. Each had its own supply chains, capital structures, and workers. The smartphone did more than compete with them. It absorbed them wholesale. What sits in your pocket is a piece of general-purpose economic infrastructure of a kind that previous generations would have recognized. That's the sort of thing a state or a large corporation builds and owns. This time, it was sold to you at retail, and you took it home. The peculiarity of the arrangement becomes clearer when you look at where the value settles. Apple does not own the cameras people use to generate photographs. It sells the camera and then operates the store through which photographs are shared. Google does not own the roads down which cars drive, it owns the map. Amazon does not own the warehouses of the independent sellers on its marketplace. Meta owns almost none of the content on its platforms. The productive assets, broadly defined, sit distributed across hundreds of millions of private households. The coordinating layer sits in a few tall buildings in Cupertino, Mountain View, Seattle, and Menlo Park. The returns flow almost entirely to the coordinating layer. In 2023 alone, Apple's App Store generated well over $1 trillion in billings, of which Apple kept its 30% cut. Meta's advertising revenue, derived almost entirely from content it did not create and attention it did not produce, came to roughly $930 billion. A split that was never argued for. One response to this is to say that coordination is hard, and whoever does it well deserves to be paid. That is fair as far as it goes. Running a global platform at the scale of iOS or Android is genuinely difficult, and the companies that do it employ some of the most capable engineers and managers on the planet. Nobody is suggesting they should work for nothing. The question is whether the current split between what the coordinator keeps and what the underlying contributors keep has any principled basis, or whether it simply reflects that, when these markets were forming, nobody thought to ask. I think it is mostly the latter. When the App Store launched in 2008, the 70/30 revenue split Apple imposed on developers was not the product of a long theoretical argument about the fair division of platform returns. It was close to the margin that content distributors had taken for decades, applied almost reflexively to a new medium. When Facebook began monetizing user activity at scale, there was no negotiation either. The terms of service appeared, and people clicked through them. These splits are now treated as natural facts of the digital economy, but they were contingent choices made quickly, in specific commercial circumstances, by people who had every reason to set them where they did. It is worth pausing to consider what users actually contribute, because the conventional framing understates it. The standard story has users providing attention and data, and the platform providing the service. That is true and incomplete. Users also provide the hardware, the electricity, and the bandwidth through a home broadband contract they pay for themselves. They provide, in aggregate, the training data on which the next generation of artificial intelligence is being built. When a Tesla navigates an unfamiliar junction, it is drawing on billions of miles driven by ordinary owners, none of whom were compensated for their contribution to the model. When a large language model gets better at writing, it is getting better on the back of text produced by people who were not asked and will not be paid. None of this is hidden. It is all perfectly visible in the public accounts of the companies involved. What is missing is any serious institutional mechanism by which the people who supply the infrastructure and the data might share in the returns that infrastructure and data generate. Wages went some way to addressing the equivalent problem in the industrial economy, imperfectly and after a long fight. The digital economy has not yet found its equivalent. Serial economies and parallel economies. There is an obvious objection to all of this, and I should address it directly. Owning an iPhone is not the same as owning a share of Apple. The user may provide the hardware, the data, and the electricity, but the user does not own the operating system, the App Store, the payment rails, or the network effects that make the whole thing valuable. Apple and Google are not renting infrastructure from users in any meaningful legal or economic sense. They are selling a service whose terms the user accepts. On that view, the language of ownership I have been using is a rhetorical trick. I think the objection proves less than it appears to, and the reason has to do with a structural feature of the internet economy that classical economic vocabulary was never designed to describe. In the physical economy, production runs as a line. Raw materials go to the factory produces the goods reach the distributor, and the distributor sells to the consumer. Value is added at each stage, and the consumer sits at the end of the chain. Roles are cleanly separated. Producers produce, consumers consume, and the transaction terminates when money and goods change hands. Any benefit the consumer derives beyond what they paid is labeled consumer surplus, a private bonus with no claim on ownership of what came before. Property rights accrue upstream to those who supplied the inputs. The entire vocabulary of classical economics, including supply, demand, producer, consumer, and externality, grew up inside this serial structure and describes it well. The internet economy does not run as a line, it runs as two circuits in parallel. In the first circuit, the company writes the software and delivers the service, and the user receives it. In the second circuit, the user supplies the device, the network connection, the electricity, the attention, the data, and the behavior, and the company receives those. Both circuits run simultaneously, and neither produces anything on its own. Software without hardware is unexecuted code. Hardware without software is plastic and glass. The user is not standing at the end of a chain. They are simultaneously the receiving end of the first circuit and the supplying end of the second. This structure does not exist in the physical world. When somebody drinks a coffee at Starbucks, they are not, in that same moment, producing anything for Starbucks. They are a consumer, and her role ends there. When somebody scrolls through Instagram, they are, in that same moment, producing the thing they are consuming. Her attention trains the algorithm, her clicks shape recommendations, her content fills the feed, and her social graph is a large part of what makes the network valuable to anyone else. This is not a consumer who happens as a side effect to contribute something. It is the full input side of a second circuit that is structurally essential to the platform's operation. The standard objection sounds firm because it deploys serial structure concepts, consumer, input, surplus, onto a parallel structure phenomenon. The vocabulary and the object have come apart. Classical economics still accurately describes serial economies. The problem is that the internet has produced a structural form with no physical world precedent, and we are still using physical world vocabulary to describe it. When a single person occupies both circuits at once, concepts like consumer surplus and the Starbucks analogy lose their object. They answer a question that no longer applies. The facts are not in dispute. Once the structural point is in view, the factual situation is actually straightforward. The internet now covers almost everyone, and inside that coverage, the production of digital value is something the two sides do together. On one side, companies write the software, operate the platforms, and provide the services. On the other side, users pay for the devices, pay for the broadband, pay for the electricity, and supply the time, attention, behavior, social relations, raw data, and, increasingly, the training material that the next generation of artificial intelligence depends on. Neither side can produce the outputs alone. Software without users is dormant code. User activity without software is a crowd of people staring at nothing. This is not a contested claim. It is the daily operational reality of every major digital platform, visible in their own disclosures and in the accounts of anyone who uses them. The difficulty is not that the facts are obscure. The difficulty is that the language we use to describe commerce was built for a world in which production and consumption happened in different places, performed by different people. In that older world, the user really was at the receiving end. In this one, they is on both sides of the same transaction at the same time. Once that is acknowledged, the current distribution of returns no longer looks like a natural outcome. It looks like what it is. One side of a joint production arrangement has been paid in full for the work of both. The user has been given free use of the service in exchange for providing the infrastructure, the data, and the attention that make the service valuable in the first place. This is sometimes described as a fair exchange, but the exchange has never been priced. Nobody has calculated the user's contribution because the institutional machinery for doing so has not yet been built. Why is discussion itself the mechanism? It is tempting to think that changing an arrangement of this scale would require a political movement, a piece of legislation, or, at the very least, a long academic argument. All of those may eventually play a part. But the mechanism of change in a digital society differs from that in an industrial one, and it begins earlier than is usually supposed. It begins with the arrangement being seen for what it is by enough people in public. The Internet is, among other things, a machine for amplifying what gets said out loud. Once a clear description of the joint production arrangement enters circulation, the same algorithms that currently deliver attention to platform operators will deliver that description to more users, who will in turn discuss it, push back on it, refine it, and push it further out. The platforms cannot prevent this without undermining the mechanism that makes them valuable in the first place. Their distribution system is agnostic about content. It amplifies whatever holds attention. A clear account of how value is actually produced and where it is actually going holds attention for an obvious reason. And once a description of that kind is in wide circulation, the rest follows faster than industrial instincts tell us it should. The assumption that institutional change is always slow comes from looking at economies in which the distribution of information is itself slow. In a parallel structure where a single clear idea can reach most of the population within weeks, the lag between recognition and behavioral change collapses. We have already seen this within the digital economy itself, on a matter of mere hardware preference. Nokia did not fall because regulators intervened or because a legislature passed a reform. Nokia fell because ordinary users looked at what had arrived and chose something else, and they did so at a speed that nobody in the old consumer electronics industry had prepared for. The same mechanism applies to the question of how digital value is shared. Once users clearly see that they are joint producers of what the platforms sell, their choices shift, and when enough of those choices shift, the structure shifts with them. What follows is not redistribution in the old sense. It is a change in what the arrangement looks like to the people inside it. Companies do not need to be forced to concede anything because users stop granting the current arrangement the tacit consent it has quietly relied on. Alternative platforms, creator-owned models, and user equity experiments that currently sit at the margins move toward the the arrangement that had seemed like a default starts to look like a choice. And defaults that look like choices do not survive long in a market where users have the power to move. Registration, not redistribution. There is a particular trap worth naming before closing. When a question of this kind is raised, the instinct is to reach for historical analogies, for theories of change, for models of how economic transformation has worked in the past. I have done some of that myself in this piece. But there is a cost to framing the question historically, and it is the same cost as framing it through any external authority. Once you ask what history suggests, or what the experts conclude, or what the balance of forces will permit, you have handed away the only piece of the question that was actually yours to answer. You have stepped out of the decision and into the commentary. The decision is simpler than the commentary. Each person who contributes to a platform can ask, straightforwardly, whether their contribution is worth something, whether the current arrangement reflects that, and whether an arrangement in which they held a share would suit them better. These are not hard questions. They have the feature that most individual answers to them will be the same because the structural situation everyone is in is the same. And when most individual answers to the same question line up, what looks from outside like a massive collective action problem turns out, from inside, to be something close to consensus. Nobody had to be persuaded. Everyone had already worked it out for themselves. This is the part the historical frame obscures. In the historical frame, change is always a zero-sum contest between parties with conflicting interests, mediated by institutions that ratify the outcome. That picture fits an industrial economy well. It does not fit this one. Here, the interests of the ordinary user and the ordinary user are not in conflict. They are the same interest, held by hundreds of millions of people who have not yet noticed they share it. The platforms, for all their scale, are a minority in this arrangement. When a minority sees itself as a minority, its behavior changes. The companies that currently operate the platforms are not unintelligent. They will read the shift as quickly as anyone, and many of them will reposition to court the majority rather than extract from it, because courting the majority is where the returns will come from next. This is not a prediction about morality. It is a prediction about where the money will be. A different way of thinking about the giants. If any of this is right, it suggests a different way of thinking about the technology giants. The usual framing, now standard in antitrust discussions on both sides of the Atlantic, treats them as monopolists who need to be restrained. There is something to this, though it misses part of what is going on. These companies are doing more than dominating their sectors. They are running pieces of general-purpose infrastructure that the rest of the economy increasingly depends on. Using an ownership model inherited from an earlier era when infrastructure of this kind was either state-owned or heavily regulated. The question is not only whether they have too much market power, it is whether the ownership structure itself is the right one for what these systems have become. Imagine, as a thought experiment, that the underlying platforms were organized to reflect the parallel structure rather than obscure it. Suppose the people who supplied the hardware, the data, and the daily activities collectively held the majority of the equity, with the operating companies holding a substantial minority stake. The operators would still have strong commercial incentives to run the systems well. They would still compete and innovate. The returns, however, would flow, in large part, back to the people whose participation makes them possible. A rough 80-20 split in favor of users, with the 20 held by the operating company, is one plausible shape. Others are possible. The point is that the current arrangement, in which users hold essentially nothing, is not the only option on the table, and the arguments for it are weaker than the familiarity of it suggests. Something like this reframing is going to become harder to avoid as artificial intelligence moves from novelty to general-purpose technology. The models now being built will increasingly run on infrastructure that ordinary people provide and data that ordinary people generate. If the returns from those models accrue solely to the companies that trained them, the gap between what users contribute and what users receive will grow from large to very large indeed. Something will give. It would be better to provide the ownership structure rather than the political settlement that currently holds it in place. The existing arrangement has had 2 decades to settle, and to anyone looking at it from the inside, it looks stable, profitable, and permanent. Most such arrangements look that way until they don't. The device in your pocket is yours. The data it generates comes from your life, and once enough people can clearly see where the value goes and why, the arrangement that sends it there stops being the only one that seems natural.